Nobody asked. That's the thing you might not have words for yet. But somewhere inside you, you already know exactly what this is about. Nobody sat down next to you and said, "How are you feeling about that?" Not really. Not in a way that left space for a real answer. Not in a way where you felt like the answer actually mattered. If you grew up in a home where your emotions were rarely, if ever, invited, this video is about you. Not your childhood in general. Not your family as a whole. Just this one quiet thing. This one specific experience of being a child whose inner world was never quite asked about. And maybe you've never even named it before. Maybe you just assumed that's how childhood worked for everyone. Maybe you told yourself it wasn't a big deal, that plenty of kids had it harder, that you were fed and clothed and kept safe, and that should have been enough. But something in you kept score anyway. Something in you noticed every time you came home from a hard day at school and nobody asked. Every time something frightened you and you swallowed it quietly. Every time you were visibly upset and the room just moved on. Here is the question that will stay with us through everything that follows. If no one ever asked how you felt, what did you learn to do with everything you felt? That question doesn't have a simple answer. And we're not going to rush toward one. But by the time we reach the end of this, something will be clearer. Something that's been quietly shaping you. Your relationships, your inner voice, the way you move through difficulty, will have a name. Stay with this. It didn't happen in one dramatic moment. That's what makes it so hard to point to. There was no single event. No incident to locate and examine. It was more like a pattern, subtle, consistent, ambient. The emotional temperature of a home that simply didn't turn in your direction very often. Maybe the adults around you were distracted. Maybe they were carrying their own weight, grief, stress, survival. And the idea of sitting with a child's feelings was a luxury they didn't know how to afford. Maybe emotions in your family were treated as inconvenient, as something to move through quickly or not at all. Maybe feelings were only acknowledged when they became disruptive, when you cried too loudly or acted out or shut down so completely that someone finally noticed. But in the ordinary moments, in the quiet, daily texture of life, you were largely left to process things alone. And here is what that actually feels like from the inside of a child's experience, because this is important to slow down for. When a child feels something and brings it, even implicitly, to an adult, through a look, through going quiet, through the way they enter a room, and nothing comes back, the child doesn't think the adult is distracted. The child thinks, this feeling must not be worth addressing. The child thinks, I must be too much or not enough or wrong about what I'm feeling. The child begins to wonder, very quietly, whether their inner world is a real and legitimate place, or whether it's just noise that other people have learned to ignore. That wondering doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with clarity. It just settles, like sediment, like something that gradually becomes the floor of who you are. You might have grown up describing yourself as independent, self-sufficient, someone who figures things out on their own. And maybe people praised you for it. You're so mature. You're so easy. You never complain. And you carried those descriptions like a quiet contract. If being low maintenance is what makes me acceptable, then I will be low maintenance. If not needing things is what earns me peace in this environment, then I will learn to need nothing. You weren't born self-contained. You learned to become that way. And the learning happened so early, so quietly, so without fanfare, that by the time you were old enough to reflect on it, it just felt like personality. Felt like you. Have you ever caught yourself in a moment of distress? Real distress, the kind that deserves comfort, and noticed that your first instinct wasn't to reach out, but to manage it, to contain it, to handle it before anyone else had a chance to see it. That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It was taught, not in words, but in years of learning that feelings were a private matter, yours to carry, yours to sort, yours to eventually push down far enough that they stopped asking for attention. That is the experience we are sitting with today. Not a dramatic wound, not a single memory, but a pattern so ordinary it almost disappeared into the background, and yet shaped almost everything about how you learn to be a person in the world. There is a window in early childhood, roughly from the time you first begin to feel things with intensity, around age 2 or 3 all the way through adolescence, where something quietly critical is happening beneath the surface of ordinary life. Psychologists call it emotional attunement, the process by which a child learns, through repeated experience with caregivers, what emotions are, what they mean, and what to do with them. It works like this. A child feels something: fear, excitement, sadness, shame, confusion. The feeling rises in the body, in the chest, the throat, the stomach, and the child looks outward, not always consciously, not always in words, but there is a turning, an orientation toward another person that is biological and ancient and completely natural. I feel something. Help me understand what this is. And when a caregiver responds, when they turn back, name the feeling, hold the space, reflect something warm and recognizing, the child doesn't just feel comforted. The child learns something fundamental. They learn that emotions are survivable, that feelings have names, that the inner world is a place that can be shared, that needing someone when you're overwhelmed is not a weakness or an imposition. It is simply human. This is how emotional literacy develops, not through lessons, not through instruction, through thousands of small, repeated moments of being seen and responded to. But what happens when those moments are mostly absent? What happens when the child feels something and looks outward, and finds distraction or discomfort or silence, or a subtle message that says not now or not that or just be fine? The child doesn't stop feeling. Feelings don't disappear because they aren't welcomed. But the child does stop expecting that feelings will be met. And slowly, over time, they stop looking outward at all. This is not a failure of character. It is adaptation. Pure, efficient, survival-level adaptation. The nervous system of a child is extraordinarily plastic, meaning it bends, reorganizes, rewires itself around the environment it finds itself in. If the environment consistently communicates that emotional expression leads nowhere, the nervous system learns to reroute. Feelings get processed internally or suppressed, or converted into something more acceptable: productivity, achievement, humor, caretaking, invisibility. You may have become very good at reading other people's emotions, at sensing the mood of a room before you'd even fully entered it, at adjusting yourself to what was needed, what was safe, what would create the least friction. These are not coincidences. They are the skills of a child who learned that the emotional information in the environment mattered far more than their own. Because your feelings weren't being tracked, but you were tracking everyone else's. That asymmetry is exhausting in ways that are difficult to articulate. It means you grew up spending enormous internal resources managing a landscape that nobody was helping you navigate. You became, in a very real sense, your own emotional caretaker before you were developmentally ready for that role. And there is something else that happens in this developmental window that rarely gets talked about. When feelings are consistently uninvited, children don't just learn to hide them from others. They learn to hide them from themselves. The suppression becomes so automatic, so practiced, that it stops feeling like suppression and starts feeling like neutrality. Like equilibrium, like simply not being someone who gets emotional about things. You might have moved through difficult events in your childhood with a kind of steadiness that the adults around you interpreted as resilience. And in some ways it was. But underneath that steadiness was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling that had been routed underground, because above ground it had nowhere to go. Did you ever notice, even as a child, that you felt things most intensely when you were alone? In your room, in the dark, on a long car ride where no one was looking at you, in those private spaces where there was no one to perform composure for. That's when it all moved through. That's when the sadness came, or the fear, or the longing for something you didn't have words to name. That private inner life became your real one. The one you had in public, the composed, self-sufficient, low-maintenance version, was the performance. And you got so skilled at the performance that it started to feel more real than the real thing. This is the origin of something that will follow you into adulthood in ways that are quiet but constant. A kind of split, a distance between what you feel and what you show, between who you are internally and who you allow others to see. It didn't begin because you were dishonest or closed off by nature. It began because you were a child in an environment where the honest version of you, the one who had feelings, needs, fears, confusions, was not consistently invited to exist out loud. And so you learned to exist quietly. You learned to take up less emotional space. You learned to be grateful for what you had and ask for nothing more. And somewhere along the way, that learning became identity. So let's slow down here. Let's stay close to the actual texture of what this looks like, not in theory, but in the lived, daily experience of being you. Because this is the part where things might start to feel uncomfortably familiar. You probably don't describe yourself as someone who struggles emotionally. If anything, you might describe yourself as someone who handles things well. Someone who doesn't get rattled easily. someone who others come to with their problems because you're steady, because you listen, because you somehow always know what to say. And all of that might be true. But have you ever noticed that while you're holding space for someone else's pain, genuinely, caringly, attentively holding it, there's a part of you that quietly marvels at the fact that they're able to share it at all. That they can just say, "I'm struggling," without apologizing for it. That they can cry in front of another person without immediately moving to reassure them that they're fine. There is something in you that watches that and feels not quite envy, but something adjacent to it. A recognition of something you were never taught to do, because you learned very early that your feelings were yours to manage. And managing them meant containing them. Containing them meant that even now, decades later, when something genuinely breaks your heart, you might feel it privately, intensely, completely, and then walk into a room and be absolutely fine. Not performing fine, not faking fine, but actually shifting into a mode of functioning that is so practiced it feels involuntary. And here is what that costs, because it does cost something. When you suppress and contain and manage emotional experience over many years, you don't just become good at hiding feelings from other people. You become, in certain moments, genuinely uncertain about what you feel. You reach inward for information and find something murky, something that doesn't resolve into a clear signal. You know something is wrong, or something is heavy, or something feels off, but naming it precisely, sitting with it consciously, allowing it to be a full and legitimate experience, that part is harder. Have you ever been asked, "How are you feeling about this?" Really asked by someone who actually wanted to know, and felt a kind of blankness? Not because nothing was there, but because the pathway between the feeling and the word had been so rarely used that it felt overgrown. That is not emotional absence. That is emotional distance, created not by your nature, but by years of learning that the internal landscape was a private country with no visitors allowed. You might also notice this, that you are far better at identifying what other people are feeling than identifying what you yourself are feeling. You read people with an almost unsettling accuracy. You notice the slight shift in someone's tone, the way they hold their body when they're uncomfortable, the thing they're not saying underneath the thing they are saying. You've been doing this your whole life, scanning, reading, adjusting, but turn that same attention inward and something gets quieter, less certain, as if the skill was always meant to face outward, because outward was where safety was negotiated, and inward was simply where things were stored. You learned to store a lot, and you learned to do it without complaint, without drama, without asking anyone to notice. Because asking people to notice felt dangerous in a way that was never quite articulable. Not dangerous like threat or harm, dangerous like exposure, dangerous like the possibility of reaching out and finding nothing there, which, for a child who had already experienced that particular silence more times than they could count, was a risk that did not feel worth taking. So you stopped reaching, or you reached in very small, deniable ways, ways that could be retracted quickly if they weren't met. A vague comment that could be a joke if the other person didn't respond. A mention of something difficult, framed lightly, with an exit built in so that if no one followed up, you could simply walk back through it and close the door behind you. You became an expert at doors with exits already built in. Does any of this sound like you? Not as a flaw, not as something broken, but as something deeply recognizably human, as the architecture of a person who adapted brilliantly and completely to an environment that asked them to be self-contained. The adaptations that kept you safe as a child do not automatically retire when childhood ends. They come with you, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. They follow you into your adult relationships, your work, your self-concept, your inner voice. And for a long time, they might even continue to serve you. The self-sufficiency earns you respect. The emotional steadiness makes you reliable. The ability to function under pressure makes you someone others depend on. But at some point, and this moment is different for everyone, the cost starts to become visible. It might show up in intimacy first, in the specific strange difficulty of being in a close relationship with someone who genuinely wants to know how you feel, and finding that the question, asked with care, with real openness, with no agenda, makes you want to deflect. Not because you don't trust the person, but because being genuinely seen feels like standing in a very bright light after a long time in a dim room. Uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain. Exposing in a way that has nothing to do with the safety of the person in front of you. You might find yourself sharing just enough, giving the version of vulnerability that feels managed, controlled, the version where you're in charge of how much is revealed and how quickly, because full, unguarded openness, the kind that doesn't know where it's going before it gets there, that kind requires a trust in the receiving that was never reliably taught to you. You might also notice a quiet loneliness that persists even inside close relationships. Not the loneliness of being without people. You may have people, good people, people who love you, but a loneliness that comes from the gap between who you are privately, the full feeling, sometimes overwhelmed version of you, and who you allow those people to know. That gap has a specific quality. It aches in a way that is very hard to name to another person, partly because naming it would require crossing the very bridge you haven't yet learned to cross. And then there is the inner voice, the one that developed in the absence of external reflection. When no one was asking how you felt, you had to develop your own internal commentary, your own way of processing, narrating, making sense of experience. And that inner voice, for many people who grew up this way, is not particularly gentle. It is often efficient, critical, demanding. It holds you to a standard of emotional management that is frankly unrealistic, because the standard was set by a child who had no other choice but to manage. And now the adult version of you carries that same standard forward, often without realizing it, turning it on yourself in moments of difficulty. When you struggle, the inner voice doesn't say, "Of course you're finding this hard. This is genuinely hard." It says, "Handle it. You've handled worse. Pull it together. Don't make this bigger than it is." And you do. You pull it together, again and again and again. But something accumulates. In the body, often. In the exhaustion that doesn't fully lift after rest. in the tension that lives somewhere chronic and low-grade, in the way that certain conversations that brush up against something real, leave you feeling oddly hollowed out afterward, like something was briefly alive and then quickly put away again. There may also be a specific grief underneath all of this that you have never quite allowed to take up full space. Not grief over any one event, but a quieter, more ambient grief for the child who had things to say and no one to say them to, for the feelings that had nowhere to go, for the version of yourself that learned to shrink the inner life down to a manageable size because the full-sized version had never been consistently welcomed. That grief is real. It doesn't require a dramatic origin story to be legitimate. It doesn't need to be the worst childhood or the most obvious neglect. It just needs to be true, and it is true for you in the particular and unrepeatable way that your experience was true. You might find it difficult to grieve it directly, because grieving it means acknowledging the absence. And acknowledging the absence means feeling something about the people who left it. People you may love. People who, in many ways, did their best. And holding both of those things at once, love and loss, care and absence, good intentions and real impact, is one of the most emotionally complex things a person can be asked to do. But you don't have to resolve that complexity today. You just have to let it be named. This is not the part where everything gets resolved. There is no technique here. No reframe that erases what was. No insight that retroactively fills the space that was left empty. And if you've spent any time in the world of self-help or personal growth, you may have noticed how often this is the moment where the tone shifts, where the gentle witnessing suddenly becomes a roadmap, a list, a set of steps toward becoming someone who no longer carries this. That's not what this is. Because the truth is that what happened in your childhood, the quiet, consistent absence of being asked, of being turned toward, of having your inner world treated as something worth curiosity, that shaped you, genuinely and deeply shaped you, and that shaping does not unhappen. It becomes part of the architecture, part of how you process, how you relate, how you move through experiences that ask something emotional of you. But here is what is also true. Architecture can be understood. And when you understand the architecture of yourself, not to demolish it, not to rebuild it from scratch, but simply to know it, to walk through it with some awareness of how it was constructed and why something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet, incremental way that real things actually change. You begin to notice the moments when the old pattern activates. When someone asks how you are and you feel the familiar pull toward fine, I'm fine. When something difficult happens and the first impulse is to contain rather than express. When you're in pain and the inner voice immediately begins managing it rather than simply acknowledging it. And in noticing, there is a small but real amount of choice that wasn't there before. Not a choice to become a different person. Not a choice to suddenly be someone who emotes freely and reaches out easily and trusts without hesitation. Those things, if they come slowly, through experience and practice and the gradual accumulation of moments where reaching out turned out to be safe. They cannot be willed into existence through understanding alone. But the noticing itself, the moment where you catch the pattern mid-motion and recognize it for what it is, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, the beginning of something. There is also this. The qualities that developed in you through this experience. The attunement to others, the capacity to sit with difficulty without flinching, the deep internal life, the ability to hold complexity, the steadiness that others feel in your presence. These are not compensation prizes. They are not second-place trophies handed to the child who didn't get what they needed. They are genuinely real, genuinely yours, woven into who you are by the specific shape of your specific experience. They came at a cost. That is true. And the cost deserves to be acknowledged, not minimized, not reframed away, not folded into gratitude too quickly. The cost was real, but so are you, all of you, the parts that adapted and the parts that were protected by the adaptation and the parts that are only now maybe beginning to surface, tentative and unsteady and asking very quietly if it might finally be safe to exist a little more fully. You don't have to answer that question with certainty. You just have to be willing to hear it. Have you noticed how much of your life has been spent making sure other people felt comfortable with your emotional presence? Keeping it small enough, quiet enough, manageable enough that nobody was burdened by it. What would it mean to take up just slightly more space than that? Not all at once, not loudly, not in a way that frightens you, just slightly more, a degree or two in the direction of honesty, a moment where you let something show before you've finished managing it. A response to how are you that takes one extra second before defaulting to fine. That is not a task. It is not homework. It is simply an invitation, the kind that can be declined, returned to later, or simply held in awareness for now. Because you have spent a very long time learning to need nothing. And that was never actually true. You needed what every child needs. You needed to be asked. You needed someone to turn toward you with genuine curiosity and hold the space for whatever came. You needed your inner world to be treated as real and important and worth the time it took to understand. You deserved that. The child you were deserved that. And that child is still somewhere inside the architecture, not as a wound to be healed, not as a damaged place to be careful around, but as the original version of you that knew, before the adaptation set in, what it felt like to have something to say. That version of you has not gone anywhere. It has just been waiting very patiently for someone to ask. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were a child with a full and real inner world, in an environment that didn't always know how to meet it. And so you did what children do, you adapted. You made yourself smaller, quieter, more contained. You learned to carry things alone because alone was the option that was always available. And you got very good at it. But getting good at carrying something alone does not mean you were meant to carry it alone. It just means you were resourceful. It means you found a way. It means that the part of you that needed to survive found the shape it needed to take in order to do that. That deserves something more than criticism. It deserves recognition. You figured out how to exist in a space that didn't fully make room for you. You learn to take your emotional life and tend to it privately, quietly, with a kind of internal devotion that most people never even develop because most people never had to. And now you are here, listening to this, which means some part of you is still looking, still oriented toward the question of what is actually going on inside you, still willing to sit with the discomfort of recognition, still open to the possibility that being known is something you might slowly allow yourself to move toward. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the thing. The feelings you learned to store, they were always valid. The confusion you swallowed, it was always legitimate. The longing for someone to simply turn to you and ask, with real and unhurried curiosity, "How are you doing?" Really, that longing was never neediness. It was never weakness. It was the most human thing about you. And it still is. You don't have to have this resolved. You don't have to have emerged from this understanding with a plan or a practice or a new way of being. You can simply sit with what has been named here and let it settle in the way that true things settle, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, certain weight. Something in you already knew all of this. You have always known. You just hadn't heard it said out loud yet. And maybe that's all this needed to be. Not a solution, not a prescription, but simply a voice turning toward you and asking, "How are you really?" Take your time. There's no wrong answer. And for once, there's nowhere this needs to go.